She had just killed his dream with a single stroke of a titanium pen. 3 hours later, freezing and walletless in a dingy bakery, she watched that same man pull 3 crumpled dollar bills from his pocket to buy her a slice of birthday cake. He had no idea. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Apex Holdings Tower smelled of stale ozone, bleached paper, and the expensive, suffocating sandalwood cologne favored by the vice president of acquisitions. Scarlet haze sat at the head of the long expanse of frosted glass, the hum of the climate control system vibrating faintly against the soles of her imported leather pumps. She was 39 years and 364 days old. In exactly 10 minutes, it would officially be her birthday. She felt nothing but a dull, throbbing ache behind her left eye. "The numbers just aren't there, Scarlett," Ryan, the VP, was saying. He tapped a manicured fingernail against the financial projections illuminated on the screen. "The Beacon Initiative. It's a bleeding heart's wet dream. Affordable housing integrated with urban agriculture and localized renewable grids. It's beautiful on paper, but the margins, they're practically microscopic. A 2% ROI over 5 years. We aren't a charity." Scarlett stared at the screen. The rendering was undeniably brilliant. It wasn't the usual sterile, brutalist glass boxes Apex usually funded. It had warmth. It had courtyards designed for actual human interaction, not just aesthetic posturing. The lead architect, some mid-level idealist whose firm had leveraged everything to pitch this, had poured his soul into the blueprints. She could see it in the hand-drawn annotations that had been digitized, the desperate, obsessive attention to the angle of the sun in the winter months to maximize natural heating. But Ryan was right. Apex was a machine, and Scarlett was its engine. You didn't build a $10 billion empire by funding community gardens. You built it by extracting maximum value per square foot. "Kill it," Scarlett said. Her voice was flat, carrying the gravelly texture of too much black coffee and too little sleep. Ryan blinked. "Just like that? You don't want to counter. Take the land rights and scrap the housing." "I said kill it, Ryan. The structural foundation is too integrated with the housing model. If we gut it, we spend more time untangling the zoning permits than we would just buying a parking lot in the financial district and throwing up another high-rise. Reject the proposal. Send the standard boilerplate." Scarlett reached for her titanium fountain pen. The metal was cold against her skin. She signed the rejection authorization, the ink flowing black and absolute. A $10 million project, the life raft for a struggling architecture firm, severed with a flick of her wrist. She didn't feel a pang of guilt. She didn't feel anything. Guilt was a luxury for people who didn't have shareholders breathing down their necks. "Done," Ryan said, sliding the folder away. He then checked his Rolex and offered a sickeningly bright smile. "Now, on to more important matters. The team has something for you." The boardroom doors swung open. Scarlett's stomach plummeted. 3 interns and her executive assistant rolled in a stainless steel cart. Sitting on top of it was a grotesque monstrosity of a cake. It was shaped like the Apex building, covered in thick, chalky grey fondant. Someone had lit a sparkler on top of it, the sulphurous smoke immediately battling the sandalwood cologne for dominance in the air. "Happy birthday to you," they began to sing. It was off-key. It was obligatory. It was horrific. Scarlett stared at the sparkler, spitting aggressive little sparks onto the frosting. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. The smiling faces of her subordinates looked like masks. They didn't care about her. They cared about their bonuses. They cared about being seen smiling at the CEO. "Make a wish, Scarlett," Ryan prompted, leaning in too close. Scarlett looked at the cake. She could practically taste the cheap, manufactured sugar of the fondant, the dry, dense sponge underneath that was designed for structural integrity rather than flavor. "I have a call," Scarlett said abruptly, standing up. The chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor, silencing the room. "Scarlett, it's your 40th. "I have a call with Tokyo," she lied, her voice tight. "Cut the cake. Leave a piece on my desk." She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the boardroom, the frantic clicking of her heels echoing down the marble hallway. She bypassed her corner office, taking the private elevator straight down to the subterranean parking garage. But she didn't go to her driver. Instead, she opened the trunk of her Audi, pulling out a battered, oversized olive green trench coat she kept there for emergencies. She stripped off her tailored blazer, threw it in the trunk, and shoved her arms into the rough canvas of the coat. She needed air. She needed to not be Scarlett Hayes, billionaire CEO, for exactly 1 hour. Pushing open the heavy fire exit doors, Scarlett stepped out into the chaotic dampness of the city. It was raining, a cold, stinging drizzle that immediately plastered a stray lock of dark hair against her forehead. The city smelled of wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, and the metallic tang of rain hitting hot brake pads. She started walking, head down, hands jammed deep into the pockets of the oversized coat. She walked for blocks, leaving the glass and steel of the financial district behind. The sidewalks grew cracked. The streetlights flickered with an uneven, dying buzz. The people changed, too. Suits and briefcases were replaced by worn-out hoodies and plastic grocery bags holding on to dear life. Scarlett's feet were screaming, her expensive leather soles offering zero support against the unforgiving concrete. But the physical pain grounded her. It was real. It wasn't a spreadsheet. Her stomach let out a hollow, acidic growl. She hadn't eaten since a piece of dry toast at 5 a.m. As she rounded a corner, a scent caught the wet air and hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't the smell of artisanal sourdough or imported French butter. It was the smell of cheap vanilla extract, burnt sugar, and shortening. It smelled exactly like the boxed cake mixes her mother used to make in their cramped apartment when Scarlett was 7 years old, before the money, before the empire, before the coldness set in. Scarlett looked up. The neon sign above the shop sputtered, half the letters burned out, reading, "Calm S.B. Carey." The windows were fogged over with condensation. Without thinking, Scarlett pushed the heavy wooden door open, a small brass bell jingling pitifully above her head. The interior of the bakery was aggressively yellow, faded yellow walls, yellow linoleum tiles peeling at the corners, and the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights casting a yellow, sickly pallor over everything. The air was thick and humid, smelling of yeast, old floor wax, and heavy frosting. Behind the glass counter sat trays of pastries that looked like they had been there since the morning rush. Glazed donuts sweating in the humidity, crumb cakes wrapped tightly in plastic wrap, and in the center, a rotating glass display holding whole cakes. Scarlett stepped up to the counter. The teenager manning the register didn't look up from her phone. She was chewing a piece of blue gum, popping a bubble with a wet snap. "What can I get ya?" the girl asked, her voice dripping with the profound apathy only a 17-year-old working a minimum wage shift could muster. Scarlett's eyes locked onto a cake on the bottom shelf of the display. It was a simple, single-layer yellow sponge cake, slathered in thick, glossy chocolate buttercream. It was imperfect. The frosting was uneven, pooling slightly at the base. It looked dense, heavy, and incredibly cheap. "I want a slice of that," Scarlett said, pointing a manicured finger, the only part of her currently betraying her wealth, at the cake. "The fudge yellow." The girl sighed, opening the back of the case and sliding a plastic spatula under a pre-cut wedge. She slapped it onto a flimsy paper plate. $3. Scarlett nodded, reaching into the pocket of her trench coat. Her fingers met lint, a crumpled receipt, a spare key. She froze. Her heart did a strange, uncomfortable stutter. She plunged her left hand into the other pocket. Nothing. Her wallet was in her blazer, which was in the trunk of her car, 30 blocks away. Scarlett Hayes, whose net worth was roughly the GDP of a small island nation, was standing in a dingy bakery without $3 to her name. Scarlett said, the syllable tasting like ash in her mouth. She felt a prickle of sweat at the nape of her neck. This wasn't a cute, relatable moment. This was humiliating. The absolute loss of control was terrifying. "I seem to have forgotten my wallet." The teenager stopped chewing her gum. She looked Scarlett up and down, the rain-soaked, ratty trench coat, the messy hair, the pale, exhausted face. The girl's expression shifted from apathy to a cynical annoyance. "Right, no wallet. Look, lady, I can't give out freebies. Manager docks my pay." "I don't want a freebie," Scarlett snapped, her CEO reflexes kicking in. Her voice sharpened, cutting through the humid air. "I can wire you the money. Do you have Apple Pay? A corporate account?" The girl stared at her like she was insane. "It's $3. We take cash or card. If you ain't got it, I'm putting it back." She reached for the paper plate. "No, wait," Scarlett said, a strange desperation clawing at her throat. She needed that piece of cake. It felt entirely irrational, but the thought of walking back out into the freezing rain empty-handed made her chest ache. "Just let me call my assistant. He can—" "I got it." The voice came from behind her. It was deep, a little gravelly, exhausted. Scarlett spun around. Standing less than 2 feet away was a man holding a dripping black umbrella. He looked to be in his mid-30s, wearing a faded canvas jacket that was fraying at the cuffs. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, and there were deep, bruised shadows under his eyes. He smelled of damp wool, sawdust, and the sharp, metallic scent of rain. His right hand, rough and calloused, was digging into the front pocket of his jeans. Standing next to him, clutching his left leg, was a little girl in a bright yellow raincoat. She was missing a front tooth and staring up at Scarlett with wide, unabashed curiosity. "Daddy, is the lady crying?" the little girl whispered loudly. Scarlett stiffened, her hand flying to her cheek. It was just rain. Of course it was just rain. "I'm not crying," she said rigidly. The man pulled 3 crumpled, incredibly soft-looking $1 bills from his pocket. He didn't look at Scarlett with pity. Nor did he look at her with any kind of savior complex. He looked at her the way you look at a pothole in the road, an obstacle to be navigated so you can get home. "Here," the man said to the teenager, dropping the crumpled bills onto the laminate counter. "Put her cake on this. And get us a cinnamon roll, please." Scarlett felt her jaw tighten. She wasn't used to charity. She despised it. "You don't need to do that," she said, her tone much harsher than she intended. "I have money. I just don't have it on me." The man finally looked at her. His eyes were a startling, pale grey, but they were flat, weighed down by a fatigue so profound Scarlett could almost feel it radiating off him. "I don't care," he said plainly. He wasn't trying to be rude. He just didn't have the energy for social niceties. "You're holding up the line, and my kid is tired. Just take the cake." Scarlett opened her mouth to argue, to demand his name and address so she could send him a check for $10,000 just to prove a point, but the little girl tugged on her coat. "Happy birthday," the girl said, her lisp making it sound like Biff Day. Scarlett froze. "How did you know it was my birthday?" The little girl pointed a small, sticky finger at Scarlett's chest. "You have a sticker." Scarlett looked down. Stuck to the lapel of her ratty trench coat was a bright pink, obnoxious sticker that one of the interns must have slapped on her during the boardroom ambush. It read, in glittering cursive, "It's my special day." A flush of pure, unadulterated embarrassment crept up Scarlett's neck. She hastily ripped the sticker off, crumbling it in her fist. The teenager slid the paper plate with the cake across the counter. Scarlett took it, her hand shaking slightly. She looked back at the man. He was already focusing on his daughter, unzipping her yellow raincoat, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle, as he wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Thank you." Scarlett forced the words out. They felt foreign on her tongue. The man didn't look back. He just gave a vague wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it. Have a good one." Scarlett turned and walked out of the bakery, the bell jingling a mocking farewell. She stepped back into the freezing rain, holding a paper plate with a $3 piece of cake, paid for by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a month. The penthouse was silent. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of vacuum-sealed quiet that cost $40,000 a month. Scarlett sat on a stool at her kitchen island, a massive slab of imported black marble that had never seen a hot pan. She was out of the wet clothes, wearing a thick cashmere sweater and silk trousers, but she still felt cold. In front of her sat the paper plate, the slice of yellow cake. The chocolate buttercream had hardened slightly in the cool air of the apartment. Scarlett picked up a silver fork. She cut a small piece and brought it to her mouth. It was exactly as she expected. The sponge was a little dry, tasting heavily of artificial vanilla flavoring. The frosting was tooth-achingly sweet, leaving a greasy film of shortening on the roof of her mouth. It was cheap. It was terrible. She took another bite, and then another. She ate it slowly, methodically, staring blankly at the wall. Every bite tasted like the dingy bakery. It tasted like the damp wool of the stranger's coat. It tasted like the 3 crumpled dollar bills. Why did it bother her so much? She was Scarlett Hayes. She routinely negotiated billion-dollar mergers before her morning coffee. She had fired a man last week who had worked for her father for 20 years because his department's metrics dipped. She did not care about people. People were variables in an equation. But the man in the bakery hadn't wanted anything from her. He hadn't known who she was. He saw a messy, stranded woman in a cheap coat holding up the line, and he parted with $3 he clearly needed more than she did, just to get his kid a cinnamon roll faster. It was an act of pure transactional grace, and it made Scarlett feel entirely sick to her stomach. She pushed the empty paper plate away and reached for her leather briefcase sitting on the adjacent stool. She snapped the brass locks open and pulled out the thick manila folder she had brought home to shred. The Beacon Initiative. Scarlett flipped the folder open. She bypassed the financial projections, the zoning maps, the risk assessment matrices drawn up by Ryan. She flipped to the back, to the biographical section of the pitch deck, the section she never read because the people behind the project were irrelevant. Only the numbers mattered. Miller and Associates, a small firm, 3 full-time employees. She turned the page. A high-resolution photo stared back at her. Scarlett stopped breathing. The man in the photograph was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit right, a stiff smile forced onto his face. His hair was neatly combed, his eyes bright with a hungry, desperate optimism. But there was no mistaking the shape of his jaw, the pale grey of his eyes, the slight crookedness of his nose. It was the man from the bakery. Scarlett looked at the text beside the photo. Daniel Miller, lead architect and founder, graduate of... The words blurred together. Scarlett gripped the edge of the marble island, her knuckles turning white. A strange, rushing sound filled her ears. She had just bankrupted him. She knew how these small firms operated. They operated on razor-thin margins. They leveraged their homes, maxed out lines of credit to float a project this massive through the design and proposal phase. Apex Holdings had strung Miller and Associates along for 6 months, demanding revisions, demanding endless environmental impact studies, draining their resources, only for Scarlett to sever the cord today because the final margin was 2% instead of 4%. That man, Daniel Miller, had walked out of her building today knowing his firm was dead. He had walked out knowing he was likely going to lose his house. He had picked up his daughter, walked through the freezing rain, and paid for Scarlett's cake with $3 crumpled dollars that were probably part of the last $20 in his checking account. "Oh, God," Scarlett whispered. The sound was ripped from her throat, harsh and ugly in the silent kitchen. She stood up abruptly, the stool scraping violently against the floor. She began to pace. "Stop it," her brain hissed. "You are being irrational." He pitched a flawed financial model. He assumed the risk. "This is capitalism, not a fairy tale. You owe him nothing." She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering grid of the city. Millions of lights, millions of lives. She crushed them every day. It was her job. If she started caring about the collateral damage, she would be eaten alive by the board. Ryan would smell blood in the water. She turned back to look at the folder. The photo of Daniel Miller. She remembered the fraying cuffs of his canvas jacket, the bruised exhaustion under his eyes, the gentle way he wiped the dirt from his daughter's face. "I don't care. You're holding up the line. Just take the cake." Scarlett marched back to the island and slammed the folder shut. She picked up her phone. She would wire his firm a grant, an anonymous philanthropic donation through one of Apex's shell charities. $100,000. No, 500,000. Enough to clear his debts and let him start over. That would fix it. It was a clean, sterile transaction. It would absolve her guilt, and she could go back to being numb. She unlocked her phone and dialed her personal wealth manager. It rang twice before going to voicemail. It was 11:30 p.m. Of course he was asleep. Scarlett threw the phone onto the marble. It made a sharp, cracking sound, the glass screen spider-webbing in the corner. She stared at the shattered glass, her chest heaving. The heavy, greasy aftertaste of the chocolate buttercream lingered in the back of her throat, refusing to wash away. The money wouldn't fix it. For the first time in her life, Scarlett realized that a check couldn't erase the texture of the reality she had just experienced. She looked at the folder again. She traced her finger over the embossed logo of his firm. She wasn't going to send him a check. Tomorrow morning, Scarlett Hayes was going to do something she hadn't done in 10 years. She was going to admit she made a mistake, and she was going to have to look the man she ruined in the eye to do it. The address for Miller and Associates wasn't in the glass and steel canyons of the financial district. It was tucked away in a decaying pocket of the garment district, housed in a pre-war brick building that looked like it had survived a century of neglect through sheer, stubborn inertia. Scarlett stood in the freight elevator. The metal grate rattled violently as the car jerked upward. It smelled of industrial grease, wet dog, and decades of stale tobacco smoke. She was back in her armor today, a charcoal Tom Ford suit tailored so precisely it felt like a second skin, a Patek Philippe watch cold against her wrist, and a fresh coat of armor-grade red lipstick. But inside the suit, her stomach felt hollow, vibrating with a nausea that had nothing to do with the shaky elevator. The elevator stopped with a bone-jarring thud on the 4th floor. Scarlett pushed the heavy metal grate open. The hallway was lined with frosted glass doors, most of them dark. At the end of the hall, a door was propped open with a rubber wedge. The name Miller and Associates, Architecture and Urban Design, was stenciled on the glass, the black paint chipping at the edges. Scarlett walked toward it, her heels clicking against the scuffed hardwood like gunshots in the quiet corridor. She stepped into the office. It was a single, long room with exposed brick walls and massive industrial windows completely caked in city grime. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of corrugated cardboard, packing tape, and the sharp, acidic tang of burnt coffee. The firm was dying. Actually, it was already dead. She was just witnessing the autopsy. 2 younger people, a man in a faded flannel shirt and a woman with dark circles under her eyes, were silently disassembling a massive drafting table. In the center of the room, standing amidst a sea of brown moving boxes, was Daniel Miller. He wasn't wearing the damp canvas coat from last night. He wore a simple grey t-shirt and dark jeans covered in a fine layer of white dust. He was carefully pulling down architectural renderings from a corkboard, rolling them into tight cylinders and sliding them into cardboard tubes. His movements were mechanical, deadened. Scarlett stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him. She had laid off thousands of people in her career. She had signed the papers, closed the factories, and liquidated the assets without ever seeing the faces of the people packing their boxes. It was easy to be ruthless from the 42nd floor. Down here, surrounded by the physical weight of a ruined dream, the air felt suffocating. "Excuse me," Scarlett said. Her voice, usually a weapon that commanded boardrooms, sounded thin and brittle in the dusty air. The two younger employees looked up, immediately freezing. They recognized the aura of extreme wealth, the sharp edges of a corporate predator. Daniel turned around slowly. He held a rolled-up blueprint in one hand. The pale morning light filtering through the dirty windows caught the deep lines around his mouth, the bruising exhaustion under his grey eyes. He blinked, looking at her. For a second, there was zero recognition. She was just another suit. Then his eyes dropped to her face, to the sharp line of her jaw, and a flicker of confusion crossed his features. "You," Daniel started, his voice rough. He frowned, tilting his head. "You were at the bakery last night, the one with the—" He gestured vaguely toward his chest, mimicking the birthday sticker. "Yes," Scarlett said. Daniel let out a short, hollow laugh, shaking his head. He tossed the blueprint into a box. "Let me guess. You tracked me down to pay me back the $3? Lady, I appreciate the dedication to your ledger, but you could have just kept it. I'm a little busy packing up my life here." He turned his back to her, reaching for another rendering on the board. Scarlett swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "I'm not here about the $3, Mr. Miller. My name is Scarlett Hayes. I'm the CEO of Apex Holdings." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash, before the screaming starts. The young woman holding the drafting table let out a small, strangled gasp. The man in the flannel stared at Scarlett with open, naked hatred. Daniel stopped moving. His hand hovered over a pushpin. He stood frozen for a long, agonizing 5 seconds. Then slowly, he lowered his arm and turned to face her. The casual exhaustion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard static. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. The sheer lack of explosive anger was somehow worse. It was the reaction of a man who had already been beaten to death and was just watching the vulture circle. "Scarlett Hayes," Daniel repeated softly, testing the syllables on his tongue. It sounded like poison. "Yes," Scarlett said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. She wanted to look away. She wanted to run back to the freight elevator, back to her Audi, back to her penthouse where the world was clean and predictable. "I signed the rejection for the Beacon Initiative yesterday afternoon. I know who you are," Daniel said, his voice dropping an octave. He took a slow step toward her, the floorboards groaning under his boots. "I know exactly who you are. What I don't know is why the CEO of Apex is standing in my office, watching me put my company into cardboard boxes. Is this a new corporate policy? You come down to personally salt the earth after you burn the fields." "Daniel, please," the young woman whispered, looking terrified. "It's fine, Sarah." Daniel didn't look back at her, his eyes locked on Scarlett. "Ms. Hayes is just leaving, because if she isn't, I'm going to throw her through that window." Scarlett didn't flinch. She deserved the threat. "I came to talk about the Beacon Initiative." "There is nothing to talk about," Daniel snapped, the restraint finally cracking. A muscle feathered violently in his jaw. "Your VP made it very clear. 2% ROI isn't enough for the Apex machine. You don't build communities, You build vaults. I get it. I was stupid to think you'd see the value in a decentralized grid or subsidized housing. I gambled my firm on the hope that Apex had a conscience. I lost. Now get out. He pointed a shaking, calloused finger at the open door. Scarlett stood her ground. She could smell the sourness of his sweat, the bitter adrenaline spiking in the room. "You're right," Scarlett said, her voice dead level. "Apex doesn't have a conscience. I don't have a conscience. I look at spreadsheets. And yesterday, I looked at yours, and I killed it because it didn't meet my threshold." Daniel let out a breath that was half laugh, half growl. "Then why are you here?" "Because," Scarlett said, the words feeling like jagged stones in her throat. "Last night, a man who had just lost everything spent his last $3 to buy a slice of cheap cake for a stranger in a rainstorm, and it made me realize that my threshold for value might be fundamentally flawed." Daniel stared at her, the anger in his face fractured into profound, bewildered disbelief. He looked at her as if she had just started speaking in tongues. "Are you out of your mind?" he asked, his voice hushed. "You rejected a $10 million urban development project. You bankrupted my firm. You cost these two people their jobs. And you're standing here talking to me about a piece of fudge cake. I'm talking about the variable I didn't account for." Scarlett pushed forward, abandoning the corporate polish. She stepped deeper into the room, stepping over a stray roll of packing tape. The human element, the localized grid in the Beacon Initiative. You integrated it so heavily into the housing because you wanted the residents to have ownership. You built the architecture around the way people actually take care of each other when they have skin in the game. I saw it as a liability. I was wrong. Daniel crossed his arms over his chest, his fingers digging into his biceps. "Do not come in here and patronize me. You don't give a damn about the community grid. You're feeling guilty because I accidentally bought you a pastry." "I don't feel guilty," Scarlett lied smoothly, though her chest was tight. "I feel annoyed. I feel completely destabilized, which I hate. But mostly, I feel like I made a bad business decision. I'm here to fix it." She reached into the inner pocket of her suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. She held it out to him. Daniel didn't move to take it. He just stared at the white paper like it was a trap. "What is that?" he asked. "It's a new contract," Scarlett said, keeping her hand steady. "Apex Holdings acquires the land rights. Miller and Associates retains full creative and structural control of the Beacon Initiative. We fund the build, but I'm altering the financial structure." Daniel scoffed, a bitter sound. "Of course you are. You want to gut the housing. Turn it into luxury condos." "No," Scarlett said sharply. "The housing stays. The agriculture stays. But I'm adjusting the profit-sharing model. Apex takes a flat development fee. Any ROI generated above 3% from the commercial spaces gets funneled directly back into the localized grid maintenance. You get your utopian community. I get a flagship sustainability project that I can use to leverage tax credits and appease our ESG investors." Daniel slowly uncrossed his arms. The cynicism was still heavily etched into his face, but the raw intelligence in his eyes was spinning, crunching the numbers she just threw at him. "That makes no sense," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "Apex takes a massive risk on the front end for a capped return. The board will eat you alive." "Let me worry about Ryan and the board," Scarlett said. a genuine cold smile touching her lips for the first time. I know how to bleed them. My question is, do you want to build this, or do you want to keep taping up cardboard boxes? Daniel looked at the document in her hand. He looked back at Sarah and the guy in the flannel shirt, both of whom were staring at the paper as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He stepped forward. He didn't take the paper immediately. He stood inches from Scarlett. Up close, she could see the grey in his stubble, the faint scar through his left eyebrow. He smelled of dust and desperation and something fundamentally decent. "Why?" Daniel asked, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Don't give me the ESG investor crap. You could buy a wind farm for that. Why this?" Scarlett looked into his pale grey eyes. She thought about the penthouse, the vacuum-sealed silence, the titanium pen, and the absolute numbness of her life. She thought about the sickeningly sweet taste of artificial vanilla and the weight of a crumpled dollar bill. "Because," Scarlett whispered back, her voice lacking any corporate armor. "For the first time in 10 years, someone looked at me as a human being who was just having a bad day. I had forgotten what that felt like. I owe you a massive debt, Mr. Miller. This is me paying it." Daniel searched her face. He was looking for the trap, the corporate double cross, but Scarlett stripped everything away, letting him see the exhaustion, the weird, fractured vulnerability she had been carrying since the bakery. Slowly, Daniel reached out. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the contract. His skin was rough, calloused from years of gripping pencils and walking construction sites. The contrast against her soft, manicured hand was stark. He opened the document. He read the terms. His eyes tracked back and forth across the page, his breathing slowing down. "The structural integrity stays," Daniel said, not looking up. "No cheaping out on the materials for the courtyards." "Agreed," Scarlett said. "And I want a 4-month extension on the initial zoning timeline. The city is a nightmare right now." "You have 3, Scarlett countered automatically, the CEO returning to her body. "I'll grease the wheels at the permit office." Daniel finally looked up. The crushing weight that had been pressing down on his shoulders seemed to crack, just a fraction. He let out a long, ragged exhale, running a hand through his dusty hair. "You're a shark, Ms. Hayes," Daniel said softly. "I am," Scarlett agreed, her posture straightening. "But now, I'm your shark." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a cheap, plastic ballpoint pen. He clicked it against his thigh, the plastic sound loud in the quiet room. He pressed the contract against the wall, the brick rough under the paper, and signed his name. He handed the contract back to her. "We start Monday," Daniel said. Scarlett took the paper, folding it carefully, and sliding it back into her jacket. "I'll have my team send over the preliminary schedules." She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the hardwood once more. When she reached the door, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Daniel was watching her, his hands resting on his hips, the cardboard boxes suddenly looking like a bad memory rather than a tombstone. "By the way," Scarlett said, her tone entirely deadpan, "the cake was terrible." A tiny, exhausted smile broke across Daniel's face, transforming him completely. "It's $3 fudge from a bodega, Scarlett. What did you expect?" "Better," she said simply. She walked out into the dimly lit hallway, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind her. The garment district still smelled of grease and rain, but as Scarlett pressed the button for the freight elevator, she took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air. For the first time in a decade, she didn't feel entirely empty. She felt the heavy, messy, infuriating friction of being alive. A $3 slice of cake changed a $10 million empire. But did Scarlett actually do the right thing? Or was she just buying off her own guilt? Could you forgive someone who ruined your life, even if they tried to fix it? Let me know who was really in the right in the comments below. If this story hit you right in the chest, smash that like button, share it with a friend, and hit subscribe for more raw, human stories every week.